So Monsters Incorporated is a thing. Well, actually, it's a whole franchise now, as there's not just a prequel, but also a television show and 2 short films. Not to mention all the video games, but those aren't really considered canon, and are usually terrible. Luckily, the movies and show are not terrible at all, and are some of the better things to come out of Pixar, and that's already a really high bar considering this is the studio responsible for Up, The Incredibles, Inside Out, WALL-E, and of course, the Toy Story series. Monsters, Inc. lives up to this pedigree, providing a wonderfully creative world filled with unique characters from their looks to their personalities, and pulls the whole thing together with a heartfelt story. Then Monsters University came along 12 years later with shiny new graphics and did it all over again, but without undermining the first movie. But Pixar's track record at the time wasn't enough to convince a younger Janglez. If you've seen the video I did on Toy Story, you might remember that I wasn't terribly interested in Pixar movies until much later. I was busy pining for the musicals of the Disney Renaissance, and so the flashy 3D graphics did little to persuade younger me into watching, especially after A Bug's Life. Ugh. So when 2001 rolled around and Monsters, Inc. was released, I really didn't think that much about it. I did, however, receive a Monsters Incorporated video game for the Game Boy Advance, which made very little sense to me because it was only loosely based on the movie, of which I hadn't seen, and is also why I can make the assertion that Pixar movie games are mostly shit. Sometime after that I saw the movie. I don't remember where this was, but I remember being invested in it, and I enjoyed myself. Fast forward to the final year of my undergrad, and Monsters University gets released, and this time I was excited for it. I wound up going to see it with my friend's younger sister because he bailed on her to go hang out with his girlfriend instead. That's a dick move. But we saw the movie and it was exactly what I was experiencing in my life at that time. Minus the being a monster thing. This movie really resonated with me, and I actually like the prequel more than the original, possibly just because I related to it more. But also just as likely as the fact that they included a Mastodon song in there.
Have fun, kids! I'll just be here listening to my tunes.
The franchise has recently returned with a brand new series on Disney Plus called Monsters at Work, which just announced a second season for 2023. It's a good time to be a fan of the monsters. No, not the Munsters, although that's apparently coming back too, but you can look that up on your own time if you don't know what that is. After watching Monsters at Work, I decided it was time to revisit Monsters University and Monsters, Inc. again. But this time around, I started really paying attention to how the universe was constructed as the basis for how the plot plays out. Both of these movies and the show are about monsters learning about scaring and then later joking, and the shenanigans related to learning their craft and interacting with children.
It's okay, it's alright. As long as it doesn't come near us, we're gonna be okay.
But underneath those themes and antics is a fairly realistic exploration of how resources and labor function in society, and not always shown in a positive light either. The Monsters franchise and world centers around the harvesting and consumption of resources, and thus the systems in place in that universe are indicative of how we in the West think about work and labor. And this is evident in how the business of monsters scaring works, how monsters are taught to scare, how resources are harvested, and the scarcity of scare energy and the transition to laugh energy. So while of course the whole Monsters franchise is about the interactions of Mike and Sully and how these two amazing characters learn to grow, the world they all exist in is plagued by similar problems as the real world in terms of Western ideas of capitalism and Marxist discourse around labor. Oh yes, you heard me right, Marxist discourse. And so today, I want to talk about not just Monsters, Inc., but the whole Monsters universe, including Monsters University and Monsters at Work. Like all things Pixar, Monsters, Inc. owes its creation to Toy Story. After the original Toy Story film was completed and launched to critical and commercial success, the Pixar team began to conceptualize different ideas for follow-up movies. Due to the success of seeing toys come to life with a childlike wonder, the team tried to focus on ideas that would resonate with children without rehashing Toy Story's formula. Out of these brainstorming sessions came the seeds for what would become A Bug's Life, Finding Nemo, and even a really early version of WALL-E. And while Toy Story had given Pixar a large amount of much-needed success after a disastrous creative process, seriously, it's a miracle that movie even came out at all, the company was still young and resources were limited, so the creative team split up, with Pixar head John Lasseter directing Toy Story 2 with Ash Brannon and Lee Unkrich, while also directing A Bug's Life with Andrew Stanton. This left Peter Docter to head up the work on this new monster-inspired story. By the way, all of these people all have writing credits on each other's films, so everybody was pulling double and triple duty to make these movies. Docter began immediately after Toy Story in 1996, working and reworking the story and characters of his new idea. Early in development, the focus of the story was already about monsters in some kind of workforce, but originally the main character was supposed to be more of a businessman. The idea of a monster being paired up with a child was already at the heart of the film, but what these characters would look like took a lot more time. Eventually, Sully and Boo were conceptualized, but Boo was originally much older. However, the team found that the younger she was, the easier it was to pair her with Sully. Interestingly, the fan favorite Mike Wazowski was not added until a much later draft, but quickly became an integral character to the film.
Mike Wazowski!
Sully, being a large 2-meter tall monster, was hard to cast, but eventually they settled on John Goodman because he had a soft-spoken and caring quality to his voice while still providing the deep and booming roar of a top scarer. Billy Crystal was cast as the fast-talking beholder Mike Wazowski. After famously turning down Toy Story, Crystal jumped at the opportunity to rectify his lost opportunity. Steve Buscemi was then cast as Randall, which is a great choice because he really knows how to make Randall sound like a sneak.
That's the last time I lose to you, Sullivan.
Because the team wanted Boo to sound like a 3-year-old, they opted for an actual young girl rather than an adult pretending to do the sounds, as is customary in animation. Mary Gibbs, the daughter of an animator, was brought in, but because she was so young, she wouldn't sit still in a recording booth, and most of her lines were recorded by a team that followed her throughout the Pixar office. Monsters Incorporated, or Monsters Inc. for short, was released in 2001, and although it did not create a media frenzy the way Toy Story had, its amazing character dynamics and adorably heartwarming plot made it far more popular than A Bug's Life and cemented it as one of Pixar's classics. At this time, Disney owned all the rights to Pixar's characters and IP and wanted to create sequels to a bunch of Pixar movies, so it gave these properties to Circle 7 Animations, where they could make sequels in 2D for much cheaper. However, in 2006, Pixar was officially bought by Disney and made one of its primary animation studios under the Disney umbrella, and new animated features were greenlit all over the place, and some old favorites were also announced to return. The Incredibles, Finding Nemo, and of course Monsters Inc. would all come back to the big screen. With Peter Docter in the midst of creating Up and then Inside Out, the role of director was picked up by longtime Pixar collaborator Dan Scanlon, who had never directed a theatrical release before. He did, however, direct some of Disney's dreaded direct-to-home video sequels, including The Little Mermaid Return to the Sea! But I suppose we can forgive him for that. But not forget. I'll never forget. This new Monsters movie was devised as a prequel to the original story and sought to explore the origins of the central relationship that drove most of the original movie. As such, it was decided that this story would take place with Mike and Sully meeting in university, where they learned to become scarers. All of the cast reprises their roles, including Steve Buscemi, and were joined by a few other famous voices like Alfred Molina and Nathan Fillion, because at this point Pixar and Disney had money to burn. In 2013, Monsters University was released, and while fans were enamored by the return of their favorite characters in a world that seemed to be even more colorful and vibrant than its predecessor, and it did perform well at the box office, it was also the first Pixar movie not to be nominated for an Oscar or Golden Globe. But award shows are meaningless anyway, so fuck them. After the prequel, it felt right to leave the world of Monsters Inc. behind, and with Pixar committing to return to original ideas, there was no need or want to expect more. But we live in the age of nostalgia, and in 2019, Disney released its streaming service and has slowly been milking all of its IP for easy money, and Monsters Inc. is no exception. So Monsters at Work was released as a direct sequel to Monsters Inc. And I mean like direct, like in between the climax and epilogue of the original film.
It's been years! We were in your cave a month ago.
And it was just announced that another season will be released in the summer of 2023, so apparently there are still lots of stories that the creative team want to explore in this universe. In order to get into the how and why the Monsters universe is Marxist, I'm gonna have to spoil the first two movies and give a brief summary of the first season of the show. So this is your spoiler warning. Monsters Inc. takes place in the city of Monstropolis during an energy crisis. Electricity in this world is created through the power of screams, where monsters known as scarers work for major corporations such as Fearco or Monsters Incorporated. James P. Sullivan, or Sully, and Mike Wazowski are two best friends and roommates who work for Monsters Incorporated as a team of top scarers. One day, while close to breaking an all-time scare record, Sully unknowingly brings a child back to the monster world. This is hugely problematic because children are incredibly toxic.
2319! We have a 2319! 2319!
Except that they aren't at all, and this young child, who Sully calls Boo, turns out to be the victim of a conspiracy by her personal scarer Randall and the CEO of Monsters Incorporated, Henry Waternoose. Waternoose plans to solve the energy crisis by harvesting screams out of children forcefully with a machine he calls the Scream Extractor. But Sully, who has come to understand and care for Boo, rescues her, and with Mike's help, they manage to expose the Scream Extraction scandal and learn that laughter is 10 times more powerful than scream power. Unfortunately, the pair have to say goodbye to Boo for good, and they put her back to bed and destroy her door. The movie then ends with Mike having put the door back together in secret so that Sully can see Boo one more time. Monsters University takes place many years before Monsters, Inc., and follows Mike as he goes to college and attends his first class in Scare School, where he meets Sully, a slacker who comes from a long line of scarers and to whom scaring comes easily. The two instantly dislike each other, with Mike working hard to become a scarer but without any of the physical intimidation, and Sully relying on his tried and true methods and natural charm to coast by. At the end of the first semester, both of them are kicked out by Dean Abigail Hardscrabble, Sully for his apathy and Mike for just not being scary enough. But Mike is undeterred, and he joins a fraternity in order to enter the scare games and prove that he is a great scarer. But in order to have enough members to make a team, he has to agree to work with Sully, who also wants to prove he can be a scarer. Now roommates in the Uzma Kappa house, Mike whips this motley crew of monsters into scaring shape, and Uzma Kappa manages to make their way to the final event of the scare games, where they must compete in a scaring competition in a simulator. With Mike pulling anchor position, Uzma Kappa manages to win the competition until it's revealed that Sully tampered with the simulator because he doesn't believe Mike is scary. Heartbroken and feeling betrayed, Mike sets out to prove he's scary by entering a prototype door to scare a child. But it doesn't work, and worse yet, Mike finds himself in the middle of a summer camp cabin. Sully goes through the door after Mike in order to try and save him, but with the fate of the monster world at stake, Dean Hardscrabble powers down the door, leaving Mike and Sully trapped on the other side. Mike realizes he is not scary, but he appreciates Sully coming to rescue him, and the two come up with a plan where Mike will use all his scaring knowledge to help Sully create enough fear energy to power the door back to Monstropolis from this side. Once safely back at the university, the pair are welcomed as heroes, but of course expelled for their reckless behavior. But after the incredible stunt they pulled off as friends and scarers, they agree to stick together and get jobs working in the mailroom at Monsters, Inc., where they slowly work their way up to scarers. Monsters at Work takes place immediately following the scare extraction scandal at Monsters, Inc. Mike and Sully are put in charge and start trying to convert operations at the facility from scare power to laugh energy. Meanwhile, a young graduate from Scare School at Monsters University named Tyler struggles with the change from scaring to joking and finds himself on the Monsters Incorporated Facilities team, or MIFT, while he takes comedy classes to learn how to become a top jokester. I don't think it's difficult to see that the stories given to us in the Monsters universe center around the occupations of the characters and are therefore about the work they accomplish. And anytime a discussion comes up around labor, you're already talking about Marxism anyway. Now, I think it's worth noting that Marxism is more of a way to view labor, people, and capitalism, and is not in itself an economic or governing system. That's communism or Leninism. And while those are based on Marxist ideas, they're not the same. So here's my interpretation of the Monsters universe through a Marxist lens. Throughout the entirety of the franchise, we constantly see Mike and Sully working towards something. Having a goal is a great way to promote growth in industry, and what's more is these characters have personal goals, which can provide audiences with a quick reference to what these characters' motivations are.
You know, pal, she's the one. That's it. She is the one.
I'm happy for you.
But this becomes far more sinister through a Marxist lens when we look at how Mr. Waternoose exploits both the work and personal goals of his employees for the sake of the corporation. At the beginning of Monsters, Inc., we discover that Sully is
close to breaking the old-time scare record.
And we know this because there's a leaderboard on the scare floor, other than the fact that they just straight up tell us. What this also tells us is that they're keeping track of a scarer's numbers, not just for quotas, but also to see who is in fact the best scarer. And these numbers are made public. This is great in theory because then everyone can see how they're performing against everyone else. The problem with this system is how the monsters are treated as individuals because these numbers are posted in order to promote competition.
Never mind.
There isn't anything wrong with some friendly competition between scarers. Not that Mike and Sully are friendly with Randall at all. But competition can be a healthy way to promote performance and achieve goals. I mean, that's what we're all taught, right? Well, that's actually wrong. Okay, well, it's not wrong. It does promote determination and teach perseverance to achieve better performance, and that would all be well and good, but this particular competition isn't just a friendly one. It's an institutionalized one. As I said, all the numbers are posted publicly by Monsters Inc., and scarers are encouraged to be the best through incentivized rewards because the company actually profits off this competition, which sounds like everyone wins, but that's where the fallacy of institutionalized competition comes into play. Karl Marx came up with this idea called labor power. Everyone has labor power. It's simply one person's individual ability to accomplish work, and on any given day you can accomplish only so much labor. If the value of your time and labor is enough to offset the amount of energy you need to survive for that day, then you're sitting pretty. By that, Marx means if you use your labor power at work and produce enough output or compensation equal to the amount that you require to survive or thrive, then you have completed your labor obligations. And it gets better because if that labor only took you 4 hours, you could choose to spend all your remaining time doing anything else. But when corporations get involved, they want to make a profit. And that profit, according to Marx, is made by having a person work beyond the minimum amount of labor required in order to pocket whatever gains are made during that extra labor time. Now, this is a simplified version of Marx's argument, but essentially he believed that corporations and those who run them were and are exploiting the labor power of their workers in order to gain more money without compensating the workers for the labor they produced beyond the minimum amount. And we see this at Monsters Inc. too. Despite the technical skill required to be a mifter, Tyler is not paid well.
Now it's time to earn your minimum wage.
Not to mention the fact that Mike and Sully are top scarers but live together in a small apartment. This could be that they're just best friends, but it begs the question, can they even afford to live apart? But what does this have to do with competition? Well, if those pesky labor laws prevent companies from forcing employees to work longer shifts to exploit their labor power, then companies often find other ways to get more labor power out of their employees. An easy way to do this is to create something that people care about, like a competition. Now all the employees want to work harder to be seen as the best, and a prize is often not even needed as people will naturally compete for little more than bragging rights. The result is that everyone works harder or produces more labor power in the same amount of time. And although the top prize or place will only go to one person, in the end it's Monsters Inc. that wins by getting more labor for the same price. And if you think this doesn't happen in the real world, then you are sorely mistaken. Companies do this kind of thing all the time, and not always as competitions. They may try many different kinds of schemes to get employees to work more for less. The way that Monsters Incorporated, the company, frames competition as a form of self-growth is simply another way to get more labor out of people. And people eat this shit up, which is why a prize isn't necessary. In Monsters at Work, we see Mike wind up working for an obscenely long amount of time.
You've been at this 18 hours straight. You need to take a break.
And this is presented to us as a heroic sacrifice, but at the end of the day, Mike is just damaging his body and mind as an employee of his own company so that the company can justify its own existence. And while he is trying to prove that Laugh Energy is a viable alternative, he's still exploiting his own labor power for the benefit of a corporation. If you're thinking, well, hard work and caring about your job, self-promotion, and giving to a company are all good things, then you're right. Hard work and dedication to any craft is important, but not if others are profiting off of your hard work, and you see none of the returns that are legitimately yours. This is hard for us to see when these things happen because we're taught from such a young age to strive for great things through our own hard work. It's ingrained into our educational systems. Ideally, this is to create independent and stand-up citizens, but from a cynical standpoint, it could be that these values are instilled in us in order to make sure we become exploitable labor power. That is a very, very cynical hot take. And this is no different in the Monsters universe. In Monsters University, the central conflict revolves around the fraternity and sororities competing to prove who is the best scarer. This would seem to be a friendly competition. Of course, Mike and Sully have their own stakes aside from this, but when you think about the university's position, this is a way to hone the skills of its students with very little extra work or cost. Imagine if you could get students to study outside of class for something when no marks are awarded. That way, when they show up for class, they've studied beyond what is required, creating better students, which only reflects better on the university in terms of graduation numbers. When those students do graduate, or work in the mailroom, they're instilled with this idea of competition.
I bet we break the all-time record in our first year.
Mike, we're mail guys.
I know. I'm talking about the record for letters delivered.
And the real winner is still the company profiting off their hard work, as Mike and Sully do more for the same amount of pay. Mike and Sully rising up through the ranks of Monsters, Inc. is also another form of exploitation. In the past, many people could do that, and it was seen as a great thing to do. You finished school and you got any job, usually from a friend or family member. Companies would bring in young people with the promise of promotion through the company, and the company appeared to care about you as you rose up through it. But this is also a form of getting more work out of you, or at least to stop you from working for the competition because you felt valued. And in smaller companies, this was probably the case, but really it was a way of keeping people in the company because they felt like a member of a community and would be willing to sacrifice and work for a community if they saw themselves as part of the community for a long amount of time. Interestingly, this phenomenon has gone largely to the wayside, and a big part of that is post-secondary education, which is more commonplace and far more technical now. Based on the fact that Monsters, Inc. came out in 2001, and Mike and Sully are veterans at this point, we can assume that they probably came up through the company in the 80s and 90s, which is when coming up from the mailroom was still possible. Whereas someone like Tyler in today's business world would only be able to get a chance on the scare floor if they had the education, because competition is fierce and most employers require a degree or diploma. Due to the technical skill or knowledge required to do a job, it's actually cheaper for a company to hire someone with an education rather than pay to have someone receive that education on the company's dime. So loyalty is no longer profitable, and so the attitude around companies caring and nurturing your career has been jettisoned. Throughout the course of Monsters, Inc., we also see another thing jettisoned, and this is for once a good thing. As Mike and Sully spend more time with Boo, they discover laugh energy.
Laughter is 10 times more powerful than scream.
Not only is this a central plot point in the story, it also gives us some interesting insight into another facet of exploitation from a Marxist point of view, and that is how commodities are dealt with. For anyone who doesn't know, a commodity is an object or service that can be assigned a value and then be exchanged for that value. In the case of the Monsters universe, the primary commodity that we're introduced to and are concerned with is scare energy. The most notable thing about scare energy is that there is a shortage of it, and everyone is doing their part to either reduce their usage, or in the case of Mike and Sully, literally scare up more energy. And we could see this with Mike and his car.
We're walking.
Walking?
Yep.
No, my baby, look, she needs to be driven. My baby, I'll call you.
While in the real world we're not dealing with a power shortage per se, but the allegory of trying to sustain an entire population off of a dying power source is not an unreasonable parallel. Plus, at the time of this recording, we're in the middle of a shortage of fuel and a housing crisis, so maybe the Monsters universe is actually like a dystopian reflection of our own universe? I don't know. What really makes Scream Energy a good allegory isn't the fuel shortage, but the unintended consequences of harvesting and using screams as an energy source. As Sully gets closer to Boo, we can see how scared of Randall she is.
Hey, that looks like Randall. Randall's your monster.
From a business standpoint, it makes sense that children would be paired with the monsters that scare them the most.
Carefully matching every child to their ideal monster to produce superior scream.
This optimizes workflow and allows for the greatest amount of scare per door/child. It's just good economics, but when Sully demonstrates how he scares, he sees Boo's reaction, and this changes how he feels about scaring.
Did you see the way she looked at me?
This is the first time that Sully comes face to face with the consequences of harvesting scream energy. It's not a case of just going in the door, roaring, and harnessing the scream. The act of scaring has some tangible and traumatizing consequences on Boo. She's now actively frightened of Sully because of what he did, and he was only a loud roar kind of scare. Can you imagine if you woke up to this shit? That shit would fucking scar you for life! No wonder kids are traumatized these days! Not to mention the years of therapy as an adult. Scream energy might be how Monstropolis is powered, but it's at the cost of innocent human children. Again, from a business standpoint, scaring a child over and over again might actually produce more fear and therefore more screams, which is good for business. But I really should not have to explain the ethics of why this is wrong. In the movie, we see Sully come to this realization by being empathetic to Boo, and he tries to rationalize to her that he wasn't trying to scare her, but she isn't able to understand, and I'm not really sure that matters anyway. It still had an adverse effect on her, and that's how they treat all children, and there are easily over 1,000 doors in that place. The truth is that even without the Scream Extractor, the way that energy as a commodity is harvested by Monsters, Inc. and probably Fearco is unethical. The people of Monstropolis don't seem to know this, as they think that children are toxic and are capable of some crazy feats.
Well, a kid flew right over me and blasted a car with its laser vision.
But it's also possible that this may just be propaganda on the part of the scaring companies to keep the public in the dark about how children are affected. Although, based on how people in the real world feel about the effects of climate change, they probably wouldn't even have to lie about it. Lucky for Sully and Mike, they discover that laughter is a great alternate source of energy, and even more fortunate that it can be sourced ethically. What's interesting about this change in commodity from scare energy to laugh energy is how it reflects the change to renewable energy in the real world. Throughout Monsters at Work, we can see that Monsters Inc. is suffering. Part of this is that they just went through this huge restructuring of management. But like the real world, a lot of skills and technology from the old way can be applied to the new. The doors and canisters are still usable, and with slight modifications can be made to work just as well. What is harder to do is change mindsets. Tyler acts as a great example for this, as he was taught to be a scare and was top of his class. But now that Monsters Inc. has opted to try laugh energy, Tyler is forced to either work somewhere else or reinvent his skill set, and much like the real world, this is difficult for a number of reasons. Pivoting a career is difficult on a personal level, and many people find it challenging or outright resist the change until their work becomes completely obsolete. And things are not that different on a large scale either. Societally, people may know Scream energy is unethical, but it's easy and it's the way that things have been for so long.
I like my bring back scare power idea. Boom, Scream, done.
And for all my writer friends out there, writing comedy is hard. It may in fact be harder to be funny than it is to be scary. And that means that even though laugh energy is more powerful, it's probably more difficult to harvest even if it is more ethical. I don't think you need me to spell out the real-world parallels of this every step of the way, but Monsters at Work does a great job of showing how transitioning from one means of energy to another is draining on the infrastructure and on the individuals and institutions alike. But Mike and Sully, and eventually Tyler, come around to the idea that it's a better method even though it's harder. And I think Pixar might be presenting this story to us now because of the importance of changing to renewable energy and the difficulties that come with it. It might be hard, but it's worth the risk if we can stop people and children from suffering because of our destructive harvesting and usage of a certain commodity. Monsters Inc., Monsters University, and Monsters at Work all center around the idea of labor or becoming part of a workforce and what that looks like. I think that these movies do a great job of presenting these ideas in an easily identifiable manner that is accurate to how they function in Western societies. While perhaps being a bit simplistic, they do offer up a good example for dissecting how workers and commodities are viewed by capitalism and how companies think about people and resources as something to be used for the work they provide rather than valued. And I'm not saying that this one video is going to change all that, but I do think that this is a realistic portrayal, even if I did take a very cynical approach. On the other hand, the portrayal of changing to an ethical energy source in laugh energy is very positive, while still showing the challenges we're all experiencing in the real world. And that is why the whole Monsters universe of Monsters Inc., Monsters University, and Monsters at Work is a great example of how actual industries function from a Marxist viewpoint. Here are my straight thoughts. Despite not being as universally loved as Monsters Inc., Monsters University is my favorite of the two. I really like how they shifted to Mike as the main character, as the first movie was much more about Sully's arc, and it's really well done on the whole. I don't know if they ever made a game for Monsters University, but if they did, I bet it was also really bad. I just want to take a moment to reiterate that my cynical Marxist reading of this film is probably not the point that they were trying to get at when they made Monsters Inc., Monsters University, and Monsters at Work. It's just a different way of interpreting these movies, and it was simply meant for fun. I tried to end on a lighter note about how the Monsters universe does some good things, even if they keep the competition. And the whole thing is still owned by Disney, a corporation that is very well known for its exploitation of workers. Oh well, I just ruined it again. Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. There is one thing I forgot to mention. There's an episode of Monsters at Work where Mike and Sully try to boost everyone's morale, and in the end, the only way they find works is just by giving away free money. Almost as if when people feel more valued for the work they do, they're more likely to work hard. What a concept. Anyway, don't forget to check out our other channel, the Cinemasters, for more awesome conversations about movies, and stick around here for lots more episodes of This Is a Thing, the long and the short of it, and whatever else we got going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.